We are recording. Hello, and welcome back to the Slack Chat podcast. We have your hosts.
I can't do it now. Oh man.
Stop recording. Okay.
Do you know, I started listening to episode 6 and it was all very somber, and it had a lot of emotion.
That's right.
And it was like, you know, one of these.
You know what? I'm going to include this. I'm not going to edit this out. This is going to be
Really?
the introduction. Yeah, I think it's great.
God.
This is one of the things about the other project that I want to work on. I've got this concern that if it's just me doing a video thing about this professional services topic, you're talking to yourself, and it's really odd. When I added in the introduction, because it was a previous episode 5 was 1 hour and it needed cutting and editing, I just do it on my own, don't I? I'm like, well, introduce it, and depending on what mood I'm in, it might depend exactly what, just how I talk about it. So you've got this somber introduction, as you say, I'm a member of the clergy, and then and then you've kind of got a completely different dynamic, in the podcast itself when you get into it.
Yeah.
So it's quite funny. But yeah, so welcome to the Slack Chat podcast. This is a podcast about Slackware Linux. One of the main things that we're doing with this podcast is doing some advocacy around the Slackware Linux distribution. In particular, the way that you can consume it, use it, get into it via relatively inexpensive ARM devices. So you've got myself, I'm Stuart Winter. I'm the architect, developer, creator, bottle washer, distribution cleaner, hacker, whatever you want to call it, all those labels of the ARM port. So I've developed that for almost 17 years or something like that. Still running that, still developing that. And we've got Phil, who is the maintainer of the SAPI project, which enables you to use Slackware ARM easily and get it installed onto the Raspberry Pi. So, well, I could say hello, but we've already been talking. So hello, Phil.
Hi, Stuart. Hi. Thank you very much.
Good. Maybe we'll have some other voices as we go through the podcast into what it is we don't yet know what we're going to talk about, do we? But rest assured that we're going to talk about something in addition to just talking about the fact that we haven't decided what to talk about yet. But 3 minutes have already gone, so we just talk about something, I suppose.
Do we ever know what we're talking about?
Well, yes and no, I guess. We've got this overarching theme about, we've kind of scoped it to Slackware and Slackware ARM in particular. So we've always got some general themes that we can talk about, but exactly what we're going to talk about, no. There's no time to prepare for stuff like that. Scripting podcasts are boring. Like they're really quite interesting. There's no sort of vavavoom for what's about.
It's like an episode of Friends on ARM architecture. And if that sounds bad, it is.
Oh, I thought you were saying what we're doing. I was just thinking of Rachel Aniston. I was like, what's that got to do with ARM? But then I was thinking, well, yeah, she could come along and she could talk about it, but she might get on my nerves a little bit. Yeah. Sorry,
Stuart, it was a metaphor.
Yeah, I got that. Yeah. I was thinking of it literally though. I was hallucinating, Rachel Aniston in my back garden, just walking towards, with some old ARM boxes in her hand or something.
How are you doing?
So she might have said that, yeah.
And
I'll be like, what are you doing here? So anyway, what's been going on?
In the ARM world, I've been looking at Nginx. I wanted Nginx because a friend of mine has installed it on his Debian system, and it's a server network, so it's very much integrated into the way things work. Now, I know about Nginx, and I have a slight idea of what it does. I have absolutely no clue about how it works or how to configure or program it. So I thought I need to get Nginx on Slackware ARM. So I went onto Google, which led me to Slack builds, and I found a really, really useful build script on Slack builds for Nginx, except it hadn't been updated since 2017. I just put my silly hat on and updated it with the latest version of Nginx, downloaded the latest version from nginx.org or .net or whatever it is. And here, presto, it built straight off. It was absolutely perfect. So it built and it installed perfectly, except now I'm at the point where I need to start educating myself and reading. So, yeah, that's what I've been doing over the past sort of 2 or 3 days. And maybe, do you know anything about Nginx?
No, I don't, but
it's new, and everybody.
It's not that new. No.
Sorry, that's my ignorance speaking. It's new to me, and
right.
everybody I speak to is in the same position as me. So I'm hoping that somebody I know can sort of cut corners for me and allow me an easier way of learning. But it seems that there's not a lot of people who are very well versed in it. So I guess I'm just going to bite the bullet on that one and, as you would say, get ready to roll your sleeves up and do some hard work.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be that difficult. I mean,
no.
Most of the customers I work with, many of those use Nginx, or they not necessarily in production, because some of my customers don't use Unix or Linux-based stacks, but certainly for testing things, a lot of people use Nginx. But it's just because, as far as I know, it's just because it's in the distributions they're using, like Ubuntu and things like that, is packaged. But I did mention it actually to one of my customers recently. I was testing something because the products that we use are to do with the web. I was saying, oh yeah, I've just set this up on Apache. Look, it works, blah, blah, blah. And we put our product in front of it, and I put it on actually, I've got Apache running on my my Slackware ARM 14.2 rather, web server. I have that available on the internet, and I was just running up there and put a little test on because it's the easiest thing to do, than it is doing some corporate stuff. You just stick it at home, point it at home, and it works fine. So many people do that when you work with pre-sales or post-sales and in a technical role. They just do stuff at home and just get the corporate product and point it at it. Yeah. There are so many people that do that. It's unbelievable. Or Amazon or something. Yeah, and I was saying, I'll put that in Apache, and he goes, Apache? God, that's proper old school. You're talking about Nginx now, don't you know? And I said, is it? As far as I know about it, it's a configurable, extensible proxy system that happens to handle different types of protocols, and you can you can configure it so that it, in the same way as Apache does, if the message, HTTP message or mail message looks like this, then do something. So there's some logic you can configure the way it acts in a sort of programmatical way. That's the only thing I actually know about it. Right. And that might not be entirely true, but I mean, ordinarily I just go and look for example documents and see what people are doing it for, and find a use case for it. That's typically what I do. Yeah. Like Apache is really easy to set up if you just read the documents.
Yes.
When you start doing regexes, but then you just need to know what the regular expression engine is, and then just spent a few hours. Like, for example, when I was doing some stuff for work, I needed to, one of our products to use what's it called? Google's RE2, I think it's called, Regular Expression 2. Google released a open source regular expression engine, like in the same way as you have PC up Perl compatible regular expression or whatever the other ones are. They're all semantically similar in the sense that you can use brackets, use dollars to indicate the end of the line. They're semantically very similar, but there's also lots of nuances. So I had to spend like a few hours reading the Google RE2, which go, oh, right, okay, yeah, our product, then therefore our product cannot do this, or it can do this because we use that engine. So you you have to go into those details to advise customers. That took a few hours to read, and to get my head around.
Yeah.
Do you know, actually, have you ever worked with regular expressions very much?
Yes, nightmare.
Do you know, I used to think so, actually.
Please don't.
I used to think it was a nightmare.
I've just had a flashback from yesterday. I spent more hours than I care to admit in Perl yesterday. and it was quite hard going. And I had a Perl hangover when I finished what I was doing, and I thought, I'm not going back to this for a while. Lots of regular expressions and arrays that I was dealing with. I was setting AW stats up on on Slackware ARM. Now, I'd initially installed it because it was quicker and there was already a package for it. I tried it on Raspbian. I put Raspbian in and I put the AW stats on, but the version was like 4 years old. And I'm thinking, no way. So I went and looked for an updated package, and it's been orphaned.
So I was going to say, is that still? I remember that brings back memories of like 20 years ago. With AW stats, looking at Apache logs and stuff.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, when you mention Apache and setting up Apache and regular expressions, and I'm no, please don't take me back to that dark place.
Do you know though, it's actually not. The regular expressions aren't actually that difficult, because I thought it looks difficult because when you look at it, it's just completely the language is just so it's compressed. So like in the sense of like whereas if you were writing it in code, you'd have like multiple lines to represent, which could actually be a single line, like a 20 character regular expression. But if you actually understand what all the brackets mean in the ordering, it's not actually that difficult. So for example, the changelog script so as part of the automation stuff that I did for ArmSlack, so one of the most irritating parts of the development was doing the changelog, because after the build batch gets to a certain size, then what happens is that it became quite a task of no insignificant magnitude to actually collect the changelog blurb, as in like, this is security fix, blah, 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 all that stuff, and put it in the right place in the ARM changelog. And so it got to the point where I just couldn't take it anymore. And so I spent a few hours, I just done some work for a customer with regular expression. I thought, my regular expression guru level right now, I should go and spend like a day writing a script to go through because I'd already got, I had a script to tell me what the new packages were in ARM, but not to get the changelog blurb directly from the x86 one. I don't even know how it works anymore. I look at, there's a load of sed bits of, basically loads of sed and grep to pull stuff out of the x86 changelog with exactly the right package name. So it looks for the package name, and then it looks for the next package, so that it knows like when to start and stop. So it's got this regular expression boundary conditions in there, and I just built all of that, and it pretty much works spot on. There are a couple of little corner cases where it doesn't quite get it right, like I didn't manage to get the ISO Linux directory, the blurb for that working. I just didn't need to do that. But for everything else, it works really, really well, actually. So I spent ages, and I look at it now, I look at the changelog script to think, I don't even know what that does anymore. I don't know. If I look at the actual regular expression, I just know it works. I know what it's supposed to do. I couldn't tell you exactly what the conditions are, but yeah. I was listening to somebody else's podcast on a completely different topic, and they were talking about how you are in your you're in these certain time frames throughout your work, throughout the day, throughout the week and whatever. And then you've got these periods where you're like, okay, I can do work. I'm sort of totally 100% can focus on work now. And you can get so much done in such a short time because you're in essentially the right mood.
Zone.
Yeah, you're in the zone. And it was talking about how like the working life just simply doesn't cater for that. You have to make it cater for that. I was totally going out of Slackware here. But anyway, I pointed that out because that's kind of how I work as well. Is I'm in the zone right now, everything is going to get done.
Yeah.
And now I can't remember how I did any of that regular expression stuff, but it's fine because I've done it. I can probably figure it out again if I had to. But thinking of that, one of the things about doing regular expressions or any code where it's tightly written, back in the old days, I was looking at some in fact, actually, I found it really interesting to go back and look at old hardware and old technology and particularly old software code. And I can't remember I know. I was looking at my Atari STs, a bit of a nostalgia trip, because sometimes I think that going back in time is actually a really good idea, because years ago, you had very concisely written software, because There's very little RAM. The CPUs were just slow. The authors of the software did everything they could to take advantage of the hardware. So, and it also meant that they wrote code that was very concise and did exactly what they wanted it to do, or within the limits of the hardware. So these guys knew about what the hardware did to such an extent that so they could target it properly. And I found that it was interesting to go and look at this old code from, say, the 6502 era from the BBC Basic, which is for the BBC Micro. Yeah, and so I've got loads of code from that because the ARM stuff, so it evolved from there. And in fact, I've got some of the old basic BBC Basic code that has inline 6502. On the Acorn, they had inline ARM assembly code. So anyway, I was looking back at some of this BBC Basic code that I have in my archive, and I was looking at how concise this code, they'd taken so much care to make it fit in the amount of RAM. Even the actual software itself was so tightly compressed in the way that they'd written the actual code, just because if it was any bigger, it simply wouldn't load into RAM anyway, let alone run. And so I was looking at that, and I was thinking, back on the regular expressions bit, it was that the thing about that is that there's no room for comments. And so if you kind of go back to it years later, you look at it and go, I'm not necessarily sure what this is actually doing. It's kind of difficult when I write code in my scripts, they're usually extensively commented. And in some cases, I even write what my thinking was at the time, because I know that if I go back years later, I'm going to go, what on earth have I done? And I'll read it and go, I couldn't figure this out, blah, 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 blah. There you go. I just hacked it in. Okay, at least I understand what was going on in my mindset, and then I can just, because I got better over time, I can go and refactor it if I want to, or if I know how to, or if it makes sense. But yeah, there's definitely something in that. But I quite enjoyed looking at this this nostalgia trip. In fact, actually, so much so that the working on the Qt5 Slack build script, I decided to write a bash routine that would flash the screen and give you a taste of what it looked like on the Atari ST when you got your pirated games. Not that obviously I ever did that, I only saw other people doing it. And when you'd load those games, they would decompress the software, because the pirates would compress everything to reduce 2 disks down to 1, and so their decompression routines would flash the screen like they did on the Amiga as well, and like they did on the Spectrum ZX when you press load on the tape, on the little tape device. And so it flashed the screen, so you knew something was happening. Yeah. And so I decided to emulate that as best as you could in Bash as the Qt5 archive was unpacking. So I just decided to occupy my time doing that because I thought it was interesting, and it gave me a nostalgia trip. Yeah,
that's just like something you do because you're bored. It's...
No, it wasn't because I was necessarily bored. It was because I was thinking to myself, how can I even emulate that in an ANSI terminal, in a terminal emulator? Because I mentioned this on the previous podcast with ncurses, and the thing about the different terminal settings is that. So, do you know about the TTYs? You log in, it says TTY, and it's a teletype machine. That's what it means, the TTY, right? Because the old Unix machine, where you connect to them, there were physical terminal machines that are actually connected via a terminal cable, would go into these Unix box, right? And that's how it works. So, for example, in my loft, I've got a VT200, a real one, this white-coloured terminal. It's not an emulator; it's an actual terminal with a serial console on it. With a serial interface on it. With the really old, the 25-pin or whatever they were, big fat ones, which I assume I could actually plug into a USB cable, which I've been thinking about doing actually, although that is real proper nostalgia. That's like actually involves physical plugging stuff in. So that's maybe slightly out of bounds. But I could do that because it still works. So I can plug this VT220 in, and that would actually be the same as setting your term setting to VT220. And the thing about it is that like inside of ncurses, and I think also termcap, it has the record of what these physical devices looked like or how they operated. So, meaning that if you try to start flashing the colors on one type of terminal, it wouldn't flash exactly the same way on another one. And in the case of VT220, it's purely monochrome, so there's no colors going on anyway. God only knows what that would look like. But so anyway, it wasn't that I was really bored. It was just that I was thinking, I wonder how I can actually flash all these colors. So I just thought, and how can I do it How can I make it so that I flash the background and then flash the foreground, and then also, how do I keep track of the fact that the tar is running? How do I do that? So I just read a bit of script to do that, just to occupy my to exercise some creative skills for like 10 minutes or so.
Yeah. I was never into the Atari ST, but I did have an Amiga 500, 600 and 1200. Yeah,
my friends had those. Those were yeah, you know what, I think I always secretly wanted one. Actually, I wanted one of those Amigas because they were better than the ST, weren't they?
Really?
But yeah, I think so. The ST was good in some ways because it had MIDI, musical instrument digital interface, so that was quite good if you were doing that kind of thing, so most musicians took the ST because of that reason. Actually, that reminds me, I wrote like a networking thing. I had two STs and I connected them with MIDI and then wrote some software to send messages between the two of them, like a chat thing. One of the things that let the ST down was it didn't have a decent sound chip. So it had this I've forgotten what was it, Yamaha or something. It basically had a sound chip, so all the music. So imagine on the Amiga you had proper sound samples. I don't know if you know Pro Tracker or Sound Tracker or software. Yeah, so you'd have those, and most of those music, the game music in Amigas would be Pro Tracker, so you could rip them, and then you could just play them in Pro Tracker. But on the ST, that was very rare because the only sound thing it had was some. Basically, you program the sound chip, and it went like this. It was like so like you'd have Lotus Turbo Challenge a spree or something, and it would have chip music. YouTube it, you'll hear what I mean. It's insane. I dread to think what it don't do it now. No. We'll have copyright infringement issues.
I was thinking because I remember, and I probably do remember wrongly, but I remember when I was younger, there was a lot of people who had the ST and who had the Amiga, and there was always some argument over which was better. And I do remember people saying that the ST far outperformed the Amiga in terms of sound.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on what they meant specifically by sound. I guess I'm just thinking of like looking at the games and things. They were always the games were the same. It's just that the same games were the same. The sound for the ST, you had to have some. This is what I remember anyway. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, you could play sound trackers on the ST. It wasn't as if you couldn't. I mean, the sound tracker software, there's a few of them, and some like crack intros actually played sound trackers, but it was very, very rare. But I don't know, actually. Maybe I was completely wrong. I know about the ST quite a bit, but I don't know so much about the Amiga. I just know that I started going into some of the message boards on the Atari and looking at some of the people who used to be in the pirate groups writing about how they used to crack the games with do this thing with a cartridge, and they built their own cartridge with their own boot code on it. So the guy even put the 68K assembly code on the forum. I found it really interesting. I did that because I was waiting for QT5 to build as well. I had a bit of time.
Was it like one of those action replay cartridges where
something like that? But they'd actually made their own.
Yeah.
He'd actually made but yes, it was something like that. Yeah. Before that existed, according to that guy. Anyway, we've gone well off the Slackware subject there.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's good to look back. Last week I was looking through some scripts. All I needed was one bit of code, and I thought it was in a certain script, but it wasn't. And I ended up reading through the entire script, and I actually, as I started reading, I thought, well, it's got my name on it, but I don't remember doing this. And the code, for me, was quite advanced, and I thought, I really don't remember doing this. And it was something to do with Webalizer. Now, it was
I remember that as well.
Yeah. It was an old script that it added some functionality to Webalizer that it didn't already have. And it's in Perl, and I can't remember doing it. But I obviously did. I think it was 2002 or 2003, the date on the file, but I don't remember doing that. So I don't know if you sort of feel the same way I do when you see some work and you think, did did I really do this? It's a bit complicated for me as this. I get that, I get that.
Yes and no. No, in the sense when I look at scripts, because I always know I wrote it. If you look at any of the ones I do, it's got my name on it. It's got what it's about, when it was created, and maybe some historical record of some kind. So I always know I've done it. I might look at it and go, wow, what does that do? But other times, definitely, yeah, I look at some of the work that I've done for other different projects, and I look at it and think, can't believe I did all that. Like, I barely even remember doing it, but I was in the work zone where that's all there was. There was no outside. Particularly, for example, if I work in the evening, which I don't do that often, or very, very early in the summertime, I tend to get up at like 4 a.m. because I love the fact there's no expectations. The kids aren't up, wife's not up, and I can come out to my garden office and do my yoga meditation in the morning, be completely zoned in, and then basically get like a day's work done in a few hours. What that means is that when I come back to it at a different date and time, I'm thinking, I did all of this. I forgot I even did it. Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the other project, not at the moment, but it does happen. It's really, but it's happened more frequently though now. When I was younger, I used to remember pretty much everything I did. But I said in the previous podcast, and I was thinking about this earlier today actually, about how you essentially, at least I do, I couldn't remember the hacks I'd done in Firefox to get it to build with less RAM by using the gold linker and some various different flags. And I spent ages researching it, and I put the right flags in to get it working. I couldn't remember on the podcast which version of LD it was, but then it doesn't matter because I've basically abstracted it, all the detail, and made a pointer record to Firefox. So every time I think, problem with RAM, let's go to Firefox and just look at it again. Yeah. I don't need to remember any of the details, but I've done that unconsciously. It's not something I deliberately go, yeah, let's plan out how to do it that way round. So I think that just happens, isn't it? The more you do, the more you kind of minimize things and just use it as experience rather than being able to instantly recall off the top of your head all of the. Yeah. Is that what you kind of? I guess it's part of that, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah. One of the difficulties I have is remembering exactly what I've done, what commands I've used, and how I achieved the results. So, like you, I make notes, and if it's a script, it's really well documented. So I don't get confused when I come back months later and think, what the hell does this do?
Oh, totally. That's actually one of the ways ArmSlack began, because when I was a sysadmin, I was using Slackware in small colo and ISPs in the UK. And one of the things I realized I guess I got this idea from other people, I think. I did. This is why I love open source, actually. One of the reasons why I love open source, and one of the projects I'm working on for work right now, is actually about sharing information. So I'm building this project for my current employer to do with getting technical consultants such as myself and technical account managers to be able to share our methods, share what we do, how do we talk with customers, how do we think about things, how do we approach situations, how do we understand the customer's technical architecture, how do we make it so that we can make our products fit with what the customer wants, how do we understand what their needs are, how do we maintain technical continuity. So on the Slackware front, technical continuity would be when I push out, or when Patrick pushes out Slackware, the continuity means that the dependencies are working. You don't suddenly find the dependency is broken and your software doesn't work anymore. You have to understand what needs to be recompiled when you've changed something major, like a shared object change. So what I actually did was I took all of my knowledge of, 18 years or 17, I don't know, of rebuilding and maintaining Slackware ARM, and all of those things, and applied it to my job, and then built an entire training program out of the fact I can build a Linux distribution and maintain it strategically for so many years. All of that came from was the fact that when I was at uni, I was always hacking around on the Unix systems there, and the guy who built these Linux boxes, one of the admins there, he'd made a log, and he really wasn't very security conscious at all. And so I found his diary of how he built these servers, and I thought, well, that's really interesting, because I wouldn't have thought of making a diary in that way. But he'd said, I installed this, here's the file I changed, blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, I like that approach. So I started doing it. When I started professionally as a sysadmin, I just did the same thing. So initially I'd make big fat documents about what went where, any notes around it, why I'd changed the configs are always commented internally. But like I had a master plan about what exactly was where, so that I knew if I built another server, I could just copy the same files and onto somewhere else and change them a little bit. And then eventually I built orchestration scripts, and then you eventually use Puppet and Chef and whatever, GNU CF Engine and things. I always built a recipe because I knew in the future that I would have to do something similar, or if not identical, and I didn't want to spend time relearning it. So I started doing all this automation like 20, 25 years ago. And so I'd started building Slackware packages for the ISP because I had to roll it out to, I don't know how many servers, 50, something like that, 50 shell servers, whatever it was, web servers. So I built an entire Slackware orchestration tool, even 20 years ago, and used package tools to deploy them and manage them on the systems. And then the same when I built ArmSlack, well, I looked at Patrick's build scripts. I was like, well, that's simple. Let's make my own versions of those. Yeah, I mean, I always really like doing that because it just means it's easier. It's more work up front, isn't it, to document what you do, but it does mean you can come back later and go exactly, and just pinpoint what you want to do and just do it again. Or write. So I had, for example, when I worked at this particular ISP, I had a script that would I'd install Slackware. I never managed to automate that. That was on my actually Alien Bob and I talked about that years ago. Like I actually designed with him a new Slackware installer. Like we've still got it somewhere actually. I've got it on the Slackware web server. We've got the design that we talked about how to redo the installer so you could programmatically configure it like Red Hat Kickstart, so you could have functions. Okay, now let's format the disk, now let's install the packages, let's do this. So you could as a user go in and start editing that really easily. I had it all in my mind because I got the idea from the Acorn for some software. Do you know what, this is really funny, you know about the 6 degrees of separation or something like that, the 6, like how thick people are all connected within 6 degrees or another. Have you come across that? No? Yeah, Google it later.
You mean the threads of life?
I don't know. I've not heard of that before. But essentially, it's like the theory is that you're only a few steps removed from each other in the world. I can't remember the proper definition of it, but you Google it, you'll find it's something like this. The example in my case is that this guy called Matthew Godbolt, he made this. So I mentioned before there was a guy called Jim Hawkins, and I met him on IRC when I was 16, and he was also the same age. So we had some things in common. We both had the same computer for a start, and we could have a similar kind of view on things. And he was already the master of programming stuff even back then. And so this software, what it was an IRC client, and Matthew Godbolt, along with one of his friends, who I also knew from IRC at the time, the guy was also a genius. I mean, what this guy had done was he had written an IRC client. So, you know, like in the same way you've got BitchX, IRSSI, all that stuff. He'd made one on the Acorn, on the Viscos operating system. And what he'd done was, him and, I forgot his name now, Justin Fletcher, that was his name. So Matthew Godbolt and Justin Fletcher, they'd written, well, actually, it was Matthew Godbolt who'd written it, and then Justin Fletcher came along and made lots of improvements, and they became friends, and then they made the version, made it even better. What they'd done was, he'd written the entire thing, the entire IRC client in 100% ARM assembler, and, which is, I mean, which is insane anyway. And then what he did was he re-implemented ARM Basic in assembler within his IRC client, which means that he got a shell of like, it was more than a shell. He got the IRC client was written in 100% assembler, and but you controlled the IRC client from within the BBC or ARM Basic programming language. Yet it wasn't actually using the BBC Basic or ARM Basic interpreter. He'd written his own basic interpreter within his IRC client, and it was like for like basic, like it was almost identical. Some things weren't, like eval, those sorts of functions, they weren't implemented, but basically everything else was implemented, and he'd written it in assembler.
Yeah.
And so basically, Jim there was a bug in the software. Every time you did a ping to someone with a particular length of IRC message, it crashed the entire IRC client. And so Jim Hawkins had noticed it, and he'd patched it in BASIC because he just said, okay, if the ping is this big, just truncate it, and it's all going to be fine. And so he gave me the copy of his updated version of this, and he made some other tweaks. I found that really fascinating that he'd implemented an entire basic interpreter inside of his IRC client himself. It wasn't as fast as the proper one, but it was really, really good. And the funny thing is, I met Jim because of that project, and then Jim helped with the ARM stuff. And then years later, I found on YouTube this guy had also done a BBC emulator in JavaScript, Matthew Godbolt. You can find it. You can Google it. It's there. He's done a BBC Basic emulator in pure JavaScript. And there's a video of him on YouTube explaining how he did it. All of the hacks he had to do, the hardware he had to, like the 6502 was documented, but it wasn't. I don't know if you know, like you're a hardware guy, aren't you? So if you looked at there's lots of things that the hardware will do, like opcode wise, that's not actually in the manuals. Developers would find out what the hardware did, and they would say, this opcode isn't documented in the manuals, but if I use it, my game will run faster. If I, abuse it, whatever you want to call it, however you want to label it, they'd get their games working. So he said, well, I implemented everything in the manuals, but then I found that some of the games didn't work at all because they'd used opcodes that I hadn't implemented because they weren't in the manual. So we had to kind of reverse engineer the games, these old BBC games, and go, what are you doing? Oh, okay, you're doing this. And so we implemented the extra stuff that was never documented. And I found it really interesting because his software caused Jim and I to meet, which ArmStack wouldn't have existed without of that. And I emailed him and said, this is a really interesting link that's appeared, is that the fact that you did this thing meant that this Slackware ARM project existed, because I couldn't have got further without Jim's help. Yeah. And we met because of you. I even took lots of inspiration from his software to do my build system. Like some of it's based around things that he did. And that's why I really like the open source. I love the fact that people share, because you can learn so much. I mean, how could you learn so much without just looking at the range of software and the concepts that people just make for free? That's why I really like it. I know we talked a bit in a previous podcast about how quite frankly it's got to the point where people need to start paying for that stuff. It's an easy thing you can do these days with Patreon and those kinds of things which we've got set up. I love getting people to share knowledge, because I think it just makes the whole thing more interesting. It makes you be able to think more clearly sometimes. If you've got ways of taking structure from one place to another. This has really not got much to do with Slackware, is it? Should we just carry on talking anyway?
Yeah, let's carry on.
Why not? One of the things I'm also interested in is psychology, psychiatry, and anthropology. I've only just started learning about anthropology, but I've just found it fascinating about what people do, how they think, how you can position ideas to them and things like that. So one of the things I noticed from anthropology is that there's a book called The Ecology of Mind by Gregory Bateson. And I've only got about the seventh of the way into the book. But one of the things that stood out to begin with was how he bounced from, discipline to discipline. So he would work in psychology, then he'd work in, archaeology or something. I can't remember the exact ones, but you get the idea. He went through quite different types of jobs. And he said, I never really figured out which was the right one. And then he said eventually when he sort of plopped into anthropology, he doesn't put it like that, but he ended up in anthropology, he realized why. And that was because he was seeing the patterns of things that are shared across multiple domains. But the problem was that people label everything as, okay, that's technology, that's psychology, that's mathematics, this is sociology, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, because it's humans doing it, there's a huge number of concepts and patterns that exist in every single domain, but they're just called different things. So when you start getting people talking about it, this is how I was able to take the way I can build ArmSlack and maintain it and apply it to my own job role and codify it, basically use the same structure. And it's amazing what you can, you'd say these are transferable skills. And so I just find it really fascinating. Once I read that in the book, I thought that makes so much sense to me. Because when you start compartmentalizing things, it gets a bit confusing sometimes, because you start thinking, well, I'm seeing these patterns existing everywhere. And I sort of try to take these things and reuse them in so many places so I can economize what I do. But yeah. How did we get onto that? Nginx. Yeah, that was it. That's where we started, wasn't it? I've finally come out of my cold now. My mind is working at a better rhythm now. So I can actually remember what's going on, even how many minutes ago? Like almost an hour ago.
Yeah.
We started at Nginx. How's it going with Nginx?
Nginx is confusing. I've only been messing with it on and off for the past few days, and other things have taken priority. I keep getting broken off, and that's not the best way to learn, because you have to keep going back and revising what you've already learned in order to catch up with yourself. I'm okay with Apache. If half a packet of Jaffas and a cup of coffee, and I'm okay with Apache, but Nginx is just so confusing. Maybe because it's new.
Maybe, I don't know. I mean, I just literally read the documents. I just sit down and read them, figure out. Normally what I do is I actually look at, so actually this is how I approach it when I'm looking at something for some new technology for customers, or actually for when I'm working on Slackware as well. It's just that I tend to, with open source, it's a little bit different. It's kind of, you can just go to the developer's page and read the documents if there's any useful stuff. But if it's a technology in general, I tend to read 3 or 4 different articles from different sources, and then I piece together in my mind what it is. It depends if the only thing I have to do is to explain it to someone else, or whether I actually have to do any engineering work as well. If I have to do engineering work, then it's a bit more involved, because I need to start playing with it. But if it's just to do consultative conversations, that's a lot more of I still need to do a lot, but I don't need to go as deep, and I don't need exactly what the full extent of the product does necessarily, if that makes any sense. Because people will say, well, can it do this? And I'll be like, well, I think it can from what I've read, but I'll need to check. But that's the difference between actually doing an engineering job. Yeah. Don't know, man. Read the documents. That's what it's all about. I quite like it.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've talked not very much about Slackware at all in this particular episode. Been some other dimensions that we've covered that go on in our minds, and how to think about things. And maybe next time we'll talk about what's going on in Slackware ARM or Slackware. I don't know. Maybe we won't. We'll do something about it though, won't we? Let's wrap this episode up. So it's going to be goodbye from me.
And very goodbye from me. Dearly beloved.
Dearly beloved.
When you first started doing it seriously, I was sat here with my fist in my mouth trying not to laugh, because all I could think of was you doing that vicar voice. And I'm going
to do it now. So that's been the Slack Chat podcast with your hosts, Stuart Winter and Phil. Tune in next time where we'll be discussing what's on our minds. We don't yet know what it is, but it will be something. Until the next time. Radio 4.